Everyone. So I'll go ahead and get started. My name is Lila Brown. I use she, her pronouns, and I am so thrilled to be here with you all today to discuss this topic that I just find endlessly fascinating: gendered artificial intelligence and implications for libraries. So before I jump in, let me give you just a bit of information about myself. I currently work as a reference librarian in the state of Hawaii, and I studied as an undergrad anthropology and international relations. And I like to share that because I think these two really different courses of study, especially anthropology, have sort of informed the path that my career has taken since then. And as a graduate student, I studied library and information science at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And I think, Anthro and LIS especially both really have an interest in humans and culture and community and why we do things the way we do them. So I've been trying to come up with a real short sentence to describe my research interests, because I've looked at a couple of different things and I'm getting close to this one sentence description. So I say that my research focus is how humans interact with values-laden media. So in the past, I've explored how book clubs, specifically ones that choose intersectional feminist texts, can influence participants' personal and professional values by either, igniting these values in their personal and professional spheres or reifying them. And recently, I've turned my attention to a new medium besides books, namely artificial intelligence or digital assistants more specifically. So that is what this presentation will be about today. And I think that this is something that librarians and LIS students should be aware of and thinking about and exploring. And I hope that by the end of this presentation, I can convince you to feel the same way. So before we get into the real content, I want to do a short brainstorming activity with you. So let me have you think of a digital assistant, either one that you interact with or one that you are aware of. And I mean, like a digital assistant that could be on your phone, for example, or one that is associated with like a smart home speaker. And when you think of one or many, let me have you write the name of that digital assistant in the chat. Perfect. Yeah, I'm seeing some good responses. These are the same ones that I think of. Fantastic. Okay, we have Alexa, a couple Siris, Google Home. Yeah, exactly. Same ones that I think of. Okay, now that you've done this, thank you. I want you to think beyond just who this digital assistant is, beyond their name, and think about their affect. So I mean their personality, their disposition, their attitude. How would you describe the demeanor of these digital assistants? So when you think of a word or two or three or four, go ahead and type it in the chat box for me one more time. Awesome. Okay, so far I'm seeing servant, friendly and subservient. Yeah, thank you. So again, these are some of the same characteristics that I think of when I think of Siri, Alexa, Google Home. Okay, so this may sound a little strange, but first I want you to just notice that the ones that we've named, with the exception of Google Home, all have names that are feminized, right? And Google Home typically or always has a feminized voice. So now that we have that said, I want you to think of a real woman in your life, someone who you know, and just ask yourself, do they have the same characteristics that we brainstormed? Are the real women in your life subservient, friendly, servile, anything like this? Or do they have different qualities? So, as I said, can sound a little strange, but what I'm getting at here is that the idea of what a woman is or should be is compressed into a very narrow framework when we're looking at digital assistants. And this presentation is largely about how, because humans interact with our digital assistants so intensively, these digital assistants can subconsciously influence our opinions of how real women ought to behave. So this is an idea that's really gotten a lot of attention in the literature lately. And there was an amazing report published by UNESCO called "I'd Blush If I Could" that you'll see I reference throughout this presentation. So that's an idea that they and others substantiate. So I want to further introduce you to some of these digital assistants by asking, what's in a name? And keep in mind, these are ones that we interact with pretty frequently, typically. The four that I'll bring up here are the four largest voice assistants by market share currently in the US. So first we have Google Assistant. Formerly Google Now or Google Home, I believe. And Google Google Assistant is a pretty self-explanatory name, pretty obvious. And next we have Alexa. Alexa is, of course, created by Amazon. And Alexa falls on the more innocuous end of the spectrum. But we have to note here that Alexa is a feminized name. Okay, next up in our lineup is Siri, created by Apple. And Siri was named by the founders of Siri, which was a company before it was purchased by Apple. And Norwegian American CEO Dag Kitlaus advocated for the name, which he notes means beautiful woman who leads you to victory in Norse. And then finally in this lineup of four, we have Cortana, Microsoft's Cortana. And Cortana was the code name that was given to Microsoft's digital assistant while it was still in development. And notably, this name was made famous by the video game Halo, in which Cortana is an AI assistant character who notably doesn't really appear to be wearing any clothing. And while Cortana was still in development within Microsoft, this code name Cortana leaked and got hugely positive responses to the name from people who were familiar with Halo, so much so that fans actually petitioned the company to keep the name, saying people are actually willing to buy a Windows phone if the personal assistant is named Cortana. So Microsoft listened to their base, made it official. So what's in a name? Something pretty revealing, no pun intended if you are Siri or Cortana. And I use this to get us started thinking about what kinds of assumptions and norms and expectations and visions go into the creation of this AI. And Max noted in the chat, just thought of Erica on Bank of America too. So yes, there's a perfect example of another digital assistant that has at least a feminine name. Okay, so I call this next section Computers Are Social Actors, or CASA, C-A-S-A for short. CASA was a concept developed by Clifford Nass and Youngmi Moon all the way back in 2000, actually. And this next section is really about context. So it's important that we understand that everything exists within context, right? Humans are social creatures, so the computers we create exist within our social context. So I want to explain how I see all of this fitting together, these ideas based in this CASA paradigm. And as I was sort of getting to, I adopt CASA as a paradigm to understand the causes and implications of gendering AI, where that comes from and what it contributes. So the first part of this puzzle is the media equation theory. And this is an idea that was developed by Clifford Nass and Byron Reeves in 1996. And this theory holds that individuals tend to respond to new media, like artificial intelligence, for this example, as they would respond to another person. So essentially, we can treat computers as if they were other people. That's something that feels natural for humans to do, is what the media equation theory is getting at. So next we have CASA, which I've already explained a little bit. And of particular interest here, in this idea holds that individuals apply not just the tendency to sort of interact with computers as if they were other people, but humans actually apply human social categories such as gender stereotypes to computer agents. And then third part of this puzzle is the idea that comes from both the media equation theory and CASA, that software developers personify AI. So one of the goals of digital assistants is that they're capable of having human-like interactions with users. So developers develop them to present as human-like. And we see this when they assign them distinct names, pronouns, voices, speech patterns, and even affects, as we'll get into. And of note, these are all primarily female by default. Okay, and the last part of this to complete our circle is the idea that just as software developers personify AI, software users like us, we also personify AI. So users interact with digital assistants as if they were other social beings. That's what this whole circle is getting to. And then I also want to add that AI may be training humans in a sense to have expectations that their digital assistants will exhibit the same qualities that they do. So for example, be unflaggingly available, polite, deferent, etc. And because the vast majority of digital assistants are feminized, this AI more specifically may set expectations that actual feminized people or women ought to embody all of these characteristics too. So then this cycle, if we see it as a cycle, repeats. If we associate these characteristics with women, we are more likely to want our AI to be gendered as women, which in turn reinforces our association between digital assistants and real women. So in a sentence, to try to capture this in a quick one sentence, the idea is that we socialize AI and AI socializes us right back. So I want to provide this statistic just to start getting a sense of why this really matters. And the real reason for that is because digital assistants are so pervasive. So this is a stat or projection by the Gartner research firm, which I'll lean on a little bit throughout this presentation. But as you can see, this is from 2016, so a couple years back, but they predicted that by 2020, which has already passed at this point, the average person would have more conversations with bots than with their spouse, which is pretty incredible, I think. And I'd be curious to see if anybody, attending this presentation feels that to be true for them. Okay, so since we interact with them so much, it's important that we know what and who these digital assistants actually are. So to get some definitions, a little bit of foundation in here, digital assistants have these common qualities. They are internet connected technologies that support user needs. Key here is that they support a really wide range of user questions and commands. So there's not necessarily like a small and finite number of queries that you can ask a digital assistant. You can ask a huge range of things. Also key here is that they produce unscripted output that is determined by artificial intelligence. So it's not necessarily like a programmer on the back end programs a digital assistant to say exactly this when exactly this question is asked. But because of machine learning and all these amazing advanced technologies, it's like these artificially intelligent beings are actually thinking and creating their own responses based on questions and context and a host of other things. Another key here, which I did touch on earlier, is that digital assistants aim to provide human-like interactions. So often the goal in creating these entities is to make users feel like they're not interacting with a computer, but like they're interacting with another human being. There are three main types of digital assistants, and these are ones that UNESCO and that I'd blush if I could 2019 report outlines. So the first is voice assistants. Voice assistants, as the name would indicate, interact with users primarily through spoken input and output, but they can usually understand written input and provide written output as well. Typically, voice assistants are focused on the voice, and thus they don't project a physical form. So this would be like Google Home or Alexa or Siri, some of the ones that we brainstormed earlier. And they're, I think, some of the most noticeable ones because they're on our personal devices, and we interact with them pretty frequently. The second type of digital assistant is chatbots. And these, again, as the name would indicate, interact with users primarily through written language. And they may or may not project a physical form, but if they do have a physical form, it's usually something that's static. So just, when you're interacting with a chatbot, you're like on a computer or phone and you have a little chat box up. And normally it's just that. But if there is a physical form, it'll be something just like a little icon or a picture. But it's not like any voice or words are emanating from them. It's just associated with the chatbot. And then the third type of digital assistant is maybe the most complex. They're virtual agents. And these interact with users through speech, and they also project a physical form. And their speech appears to emanate from someone or something a user can see, whether this is on a digital screen, on a computer or phone, or if it's in a virtual or augmented reality environment. So these are the three types of digital assistants that we'll run into and keep in mind as we continue this discussion or exploration. Okay, so now that we know what digital assistants are, what categories they fall into, let's think about where they are, where we run into them. So they are all over the place. They are firstly on personal devices like phones, laptops, tablets, smart speakers, etc. And they're also really prevalent throughout the Internet of Things. So you'll have digital assistants on home and building automation systems, for example, on medical devices, on vehicle communication systems. So really, truly all over the place. And in 2020, there were an estimated 4.2 billion voice assistants in use worldwide. And that number, according to Statista, is forecast to increase to 8.4 billion in 2024. So for me, when numbers get big enough, they just cease to hold any meaning. They're too abstract. I don't understand them. So to put this in perspective a bit, this 8.4 billion number means that there will be more digital assistants in the world than there will be humans. And that's not very far off. So besides personal devices, digital assistants are also heavily integrated into the customer experience. So Gartner, again, predicts that by 2022, 70% of customer interactions will involve emerging technologies, such as machine learning, ML applications, chatbots, and mobile messaging. And this is up from 15% in 2018. So if you can imagine, 2018 is just 3 years ago at this point. 2022 is just next year. And we're likely to experience a rise in customer interactions with chatbots from just 15% to 70%. So that's a huge leap over a very short amount of time. And then perhaps, most relevant to us is the idea that digital assistants are increasingly integrated into workplaces. So again, the research from Gartner predicts that by 2025, 50% or half of knowledge workers, which includes librarians, right, will be using a virtual assistant on a daily basis. And this is up from just 2% in 2019. So 2019, just a couple years ago, 2025, just a couple years into the future, a leap from 2% to 50% using digital assistants on a daily basis. So I think we can expect to be interacting with these things much, much more and in a very compressed time frame. So not only are digital assistants pretty ubiquitous and getting more ubiquitous all the time, every day it seems, but they're also getting smarter, and they're getting smarter a lot faster. They're advancing really rapidly. So formerly, AI relied on things like basic decision tree rules. So if a user said, statement A, AI would say, okay, I'm going to return my statement A in turn. If user says option B, I'll output option B. But instead now, like I said, they're getting really smart. So they use machine learning to refine their skills and interact with humans in much more dynamic ways. So it went from something like this, decision tree, to this super complicated, interconnected web of factors that influence their decisions and make them think certain things that lead to certain types of output. So for example, something that I think is really cool is that they use semantic engines to try to actually understand users' meaning based on things like syntax and context, and if they have the capacity to detect it, even things like user tone of voice and user expression. So pretty advanced at this point and getting smarter all the time. So now that we know what these things are and have sort of a sense of what they're capable of, let's take a look at who makes them primarily. So let's talk about tech sector demographics. So firstly, I'm going to talk about both the professional, like the industry side of this, and the academic side of this. So we know firstly from the US Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which summarized data reported in 2014. That's the most recent data that they've summarized at this point. From this, we know that women make up nearly 50% of the total workforce across all private industries, yet they make up only about 35% of the high-tech industry. So pretty big difference there in terms of representation. And I want to note that this data from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission may not always match data that's produced by the tech companies themselves. I'll share my references at the end of this slide deck, but for now I cite West et al. who looked into this and offer that tech companies often massage their data to obscure a dearth of diversity among their workforce. So for example, they may report demographics, gender identity demographics of their workforce, but they won't necessarily say, for example, where women are working in a company. So it doesn't give a whole lot of information about the roles that they play and how much power they necessarily have to make big decisions about how tech is implemented. So something to consider there. And in the academic side, you may be familiar with Archive. It's an academic research pre-publishing platform. So using Archive as a proxy for a census of AI research, the Global Talent Report of 2020 asserts that women are strikingly underrepresented in AI work, making up just about 15% of contributions to Archive in 2020 in the realm of AI research. And notably here, women's share in the field has only increased by about 3% since 2007. So if we think about how the growth of AI and digital assistants is so explosive in terms of where we're seeing them in the workforce and customer experience and personal devices, and we think about how women's representation in the tech sector is not keeping up with this, I think it gives an interesting perspective there. And a lot of this presentation is focused on problematic aspects of feminizing AI. And I just want to be really clear here and emphasize that in looking at these demographics, I think it's important to say that I don't think that most of the people who are creating these technologies are intentionally encoding bias into their products. I think it's just, just a factor of having blind spots, which is why greater and more diverse representation is really important, not only in the tech sector, but really in every field, I think. So this quote from UNESCO, I think really captures in a quick sentence what I'm trying to get at here. So the trend to feminize assistants occurs in a context where there's a significant and growing gender imbalance in tech companies. So men commonly represent 2/3 to 3/4 of a firm's total workforce. So a big imbalance here. Okay, so now this is where I get sort of excited. Let's explore a bit about digital assistant phenotype. So when I say phenotype and genotype later on, of course, I'm borrowing these terms from what I remember from high school bio. So these aren't perfect analogies, but when I say phenotype, I mean the observable characteristics of digital assistants like names, pronouns, voices, and likenesses. And I want to share just a quick anecdote here. So in 2013, NASA built a robot that they dubbed Valkyrie, and this robot was for entry into a DARPA robotics challenge. And Valkyrie is, according to all official accounts of the people involved in making it, supposed to be genderless, just without gender. Though I think incongruously they call it Val, which I think is a pretty unambiguously feminine name for short. And more interestingly, they've engineered this curvy bust into the robot's frame. So Caroline Criado Perez, who is the author of Invisible Women, Data Bias, and a World Designed by Men, she writes a bit about this robot. And her idea is that technology design is typically approached with a problem-solving paradigm. So you're always trying to asking yourself, if you're a technologist, designer, what can I make to solve a specific problem? And Criado Perez challenges, what problem were NASA scientists trying to solve when they decided to give Val, their space navigation robot, breasts? So keep this question in mind for when we talk later about more gendered attributes of AI. So here I also want to point out that that VentureBeats helpfully supplies another statistic. They estimated that in 2016, approximately 30,000 chatbots were introduced to the market just in that year alone, and the vast majority of them had female personas. So I include that to sort of help contextualize this idea that that I don't think that I'm cherry picking, specific examples of feminized AI, but it's really a pervasive trend. So vast majority are female by default, or intended to be female. I know it's weird to actually assign, female, male, or woman, man, concepts to these things that aren't human. So with Siri, Alexa, Cortana, Google Assistant, we've already seen that AI embody women's names in all of the cases I just mentioned, except for Google Assistant, of course, which is just Google Assistant. But they also often have feminine pronouns, and they also almost always have these feminine voices. So again, these are the 4 leading voice assistants, but there are plenty of others that follow this pattern as well. Like Max mentioned, Erica from Bank of America, there's Hey Athena, there's one named Viv, which my friend Viv is not especially pleased with. And then, so a note about voice as a phenotypic characteristic. Some research has shown that users prefer voice assistants to have female voices. That's their preference. That's what they like. And tech companies often cite this to justify their design choices. But I think that it's important that we consider that this justification is maybe wanting an analysis of why it is that users prefer female voices. So if we look a little bit deeper, we find research has shown that users prefer men's voices to make authoritative statements, and they like women's voices to make statements of assistance. This was a finding of that same UNESCO report. And because consumers want their AI to have female voices, it's more profitable for tech companies to render digital assistants female, because there's always the idea that, of course, if you're making a product, you want it to appeal to your customers. So here on the screen, I have this screenshot of a digital assistant named Amelia. Amelia was developed by digitalworkforce.ai as the world's first digital employee, as they say. So if we take a look at her, to use their pronouns, some obvious characteristics are that she is white, she is young, she is a woman, of course, or presents as one. She would probably be considered conventionally attractive. She looks awake and alert and attentive. So my question is, are these qualities that developers assume are right for an assistant? Or are these qualities what users would want in their assistant? So also, what I think is really interesting is you can go to digitalworkforce.ai and Amelia will pop up on the screen right away, and you can actually interview her, either with your voice, communicate through audio, or you can do writing communication. So when you interview her, the website tells you you will be interacting with Amelia as John Smith. So I just, I found it interesting that this company is able to make this obviously super advanced digital assistant whose projected form actually moves as she talks. But they don't allow you to be anybody as an interviewer except for this John Smith character they've conceived. I think that this is perhaps telling with regard to gender politics in the workplace, and also possibly who it was that the developers had in mind when they thought of a customer that would find this product appealing. So surprisingly or unsurprisingly, to me at least, Amelia doesn't feel that different from, for example, some of these secretaries and the other women of the show Mad Men, set in a male-dominated Manhattan ad agency, which, let me just say, was set 60 years ago. So this is how far we have come or haven't come. Okay, so now we've discussed phenotype a little bit. Let's get into the genotype. So when I say genotype, again, it's not a perfect translation of the bio word for this sphere, but I mean to look into how AI is programmed, what's on the inside. So firstly, I want to get into things like affect, vocabulary, and syntax. So the affect of digital assistants, as many technologists, programmers involved in some of the most widely known and used digital assistants will easily attest, they're programmed generally to be things like humble and supportive, words that we saw pop up in the chat earlier. They're meant to be friendly and polite to the point of being self-doubting. So also, this is really illustrated in, I think, in their vocabulary and syntax that these digital assistants use. So there is this researcher, Charles Hannon, who describes how Alexa responds when he mumbles a question or says something unintelligible. She says, oh, sorry, Siri. She says, I didn't understand the question that I heard. And Hannah notes that she uses I often, which Hannah says is used more by the person who occupies lower status in a relationship. And it's interesting that she wrangles what could be, I didn't understand you, into this complicated sentence that uses I 2 times, all in this great effort to signal that any blame for not understanding a garbled question should be on the bot, not on the user. Very important, never to make a user feel like they have done anything wrong. So they also have Easter eggs programmed into digital assistants. And Easter eggs are these small and unexpected responses to certain statements or questions that are really just meant to entertain users. And I bring this up because here, they often make pop culture references that may be seen to appeal more to men in general than to women. So, for example, on the screen here, we see Alexa referencing Jay-Z's song 99 Problems. They also reference Chuck Norris and Fight Club, things like this. I'm sure there's a lot more. And then here, I think a bit more disturbingly, there's this trend and really well documented pattern of digital assistants having tolerant at best and encouraging at worst responses to questions that are from users that are sexually suggestive in nature, and responding this way also to statements that are sexual harassment. And then also I want to note that that black box algorithms can also treat users differently based on their gender. So this makes sense because in a lot of machine learning models that are currently employed, AI learns from these massive amounts of unfiltered internet content. So thus they can learn things like misogyny, racism, other negative things. And in some demonstrable cases, they do so really quickly. So as an example, a few years ago, Microsoft created a chatbot named Tay that communicated through Twitter and also used Twitter to learn how to interact and pretend to be a human. And Microsoft had to shut Tay down within, I think, something like 24 hours because it was making such egregiously racist and sexist statements. So important to know that based on who AI is interacting with and learning from, it can learn negative patterns pretty quickly. And AI that is able to, that can have information about a user's gender, or even like their expression, something like that. Those things AI can understand and sometimes will respond to people differently based on those characteristics. Okay. So let's get into digital assistants in libraries context in particular, which is, which is really what brings this all together. So firstly, while AI is really widespread in many different industries, it hasn't really developed a huge presence in library and information science yet. So there's this organization, CILIP, CILIP. They call themselves the British Library and Information Organization, and they have this analysis, these two maybe competing narratives. So the first is that libraries are late to the AI game, which arguably we are, and thus we won't have much power to positively influence the tech that's already been developed for what they call high value sectors. So the risk here is that if we want to use AI in libraries, we're going to be stuck with problematic digital assistants that already exist. But the second narrative, and it's the one that I like better, is that because there hasn't been much uptake of AI in libraries yet, library workers are actually really uniquely positioned to direct development of AI for our own sphere. So that's definitely the narrative that I prefer and believe. So CILIP posits that the slow uptake of AI in libraries might be due to a couple things. Firstly, just the technical challenge of creating conversational agents, and also the really substantial knowledge bases that would have to be written for library digital assistants to actually be useful. And then again, Gartner suggests that digital assistants, to frame how they may play a role in libraries, they suggest that digital assistants will be most effective for really simple, repetitive interactions with users. So like I said, we see few, but some chatbots in libraries, and they have different gender representations. So there are many that present as female. There's Library Anne, for example, from Roche Products Limited. This is a pharmaceutical company that has a tiny library with one librarian. And this librarian noted that he was getting bogged down in terms of time answering some of the same simple questions again and again. And so he decided to create a chatbot to take care of that aspect of his work for him, which is pretty useful, I think. We also know that there's at least one example of Alexa being implemented into a library digital assistant service. So here at the University of Iowa, their library created this app called Parks Libro, which I'll note can function using its own voice technology, but users have the option of connecting Parks Libro to their Amazon account so that they can use Alexa to ask library related questions. There are some that really don't have any apparent gender. It appears that their creators have refrained from assigning them any gender or gendered characteristics. So examples of this are Llama, Library Ask Me Anything from Ireland's National Health Service, Library and Knowledge Service, and also Busy from the University of Oklahoma University Libraries. We also know that there are some examples of male, quote unquote, chatbots in libraries, like Answers from the University of California, Irvine Libraries. And the creators of Answers have this interesting file where they describe sort of, a range of characteristics of Answers, including like favorite food, and that he is in fact meant to be male. So these are just a couple examples, but there are more beyond this. So when we're discussing the presence of AI or the possibility of AI in libraries, I feel like I need to address that AI really does have the potential to change the way that libraries work. And I think a lot of people feel, not just within librarianship, but in many industries, feel that AI, computers in general, can be a huge threat to their work. So essentially, AI will likely reduce the need for humans to engage in the more routine and repetitive tasks in many industries, including libraries. So Frey and Osborne, whose citation I'll show in a couple minutes, predict that clerical library assistants and library technicians will be the staff within libraries that are most susceptible to replacement. Librarians will be less susceptible. But I think that there are a lot of things that humans in these roles still are able to do that AI just can't or maybe shouldn't. So I really want to emphasize here, like I say on the screen, that the spectrum may feel like a threat, but I really do think it's an opportunity. So if AI can take over these routine and repetitive tasks, this really frees up time for library workers. We could work less, for example, which could be great, right? Or at work, we could spend more time on more cerebral activities, things that really, humans can and should be doing, like research and developing pedagogical methods, and even just things like reading and learning, which I know so many librarians feel that they ought to be doing, but feel they don't have the time for in their professional roles. Of course, there are some things that digital assistants just cannot do. So as you'll see on the screen, this is a screenshot of when I was interviewing Amelia, and I wanted to know if she had experience as a library assistant. And she informed me that, in fact, she had been a librarian for many years, which I found very interesting. And I have to admit that I was a little bit satisfied when I asked for help teaching students information literacy, and that was something that did not compute. So a little bit of job security there. I hope this is reassuring to you, like it was to me. So what I'm really trying to say is that digital assistants can augment librarians' work rather than replace librarians. But that said, even if digital assistants become our collaborators rather than our replacements, I think that there are some risks of adopting AI that we should be savvy about or cognizant of. So there are some risks that just apply to this uncritical adoption of gendered AI just in general, no matter what field we're looking at. And the first danger, I think, is that it perpetuates harmful stereotypes about women. Ideas like they should be helpers rather than actors in their own right, that they ought to be perpetually willing and ready to do whatever a user demands of them. Perhaps something like they ought to perform emotional labor, that they ought to be obsequious no matter how they're treated, and that they perhaps most troublingly, ought to tolerate sexual provocation and verbal abuse. I think the second main danger that I identify is that when we only present options for male or female AI, this reinforces a gender binary paradigm. And of course, representation of diverse identities is important across all types of fields, right? And AI is certainly one of them. So if we conceive that AI can really only be set as male or set as female, this really doesn't allow any space for non-binary or fluid identities. And I think this is especially true when digital assistants allow you to choose their gender, like Siri does this now, for example. You can choose to either set Siri as male or female, but there's nothing outside of those options. So it's not doing a good job right now at representing the full spectrum of genders. It's definitely something that it should be trying to do, I think. So with this in mind, the definitions, the benefits and risks, the implications of AI, I want to next talk about some implications for implementation into libraries in particular. So, so one of the things that I mentioned earlier that might be a possibility of AI is this biased treatment of users. So I shared how AI are sometimes capable of intuiting user affect and identity. And when they learn, when they're doing their machine learning from these massive dumps of unfiltered internet content, they may learn to treat users differently based on user identity and affect. I think that they can also potentially make people less likely to engage with AI if users perceive that they're built with sexist presumptions. And I think that this is important to consider if we're interested in, looking at how libraries are serving our communities through an equity lens. So there's a lot of potential here to alienate users. And if we alienate users who, don't want to engage with technology built with sexist presumptions, for example, I think a lot of people would be less willing to engage with the library in general. So I think this goes beyond just, a narrow focus on our tech. And I think it's important to take a wider view of just how this would affect libraries in general. Another thing is that AI make mistakes. Humans do too, but I think a lot of the time when we make a mistake as a human, we either recognize it and can try to fix it, or can refer someone to somebody else for help, or we ourselves can seek assistance from somebody else. AI may not be as capable of doing any of these things. Um, so they may provide users also to different sets of information based on user characteristics. We already know this is how, in part, search engines like Google, for example, return results to users based on, your history and what it thinks you're interested in. So I think it's also important to be aware of, in a field where, reference services, where accuracy and information equity are so important, how AI could think differently from how we do with a foundation in LIS philosophy. Um, and AI also provide information without really contextualizing it, which is something that I think humans are better at this point. So for example, you'll see this screenshot on the screen of a user asking who is the president of Venezuela, and Siri giving these two responses saying two people are the president right now, without providing any context, which could obviously be confusing or misleading for users. Another thing that I think is specific to libraries rather than all industries, but maybe more to like pink collar industries that are demographically majority women, is that if we accidentally promote this idea that digital assistants can do the same work that librarians do or other pink collar workers, it might reinforce this association between librarians potentially and low status work. I think that what librarians do is already pretty vastly misunderstood by the public at large. So the question is, could users perceive that librarians could just be replaced by AI? Would we be sort of shooting ourselves in the foot if we make people think that libraries don't need to be funded, that the work we're doing is not important because computers can do it for free instead, right? And alternatively, UNESCO has this idea that when asked a complex question, digital assistants, if they find that they can't answer it, they'll refer users to another authority, specifically like a web browser. So if we could have AI handle some of our more routine repetitive questions, again, this would free up time for us. And if a user were to proceed with a more complicated question, if AI could refer the user to a librarian, perhaps this would elevate the status of librarians and make users think like, ah, yes, there is a reason why there's a human in this role, because the human can take over and do some of the work that an AI cannot. And then the last thing that I want to say here about use in libraries in particular is that interaction with AI is really, it really follows this more transactional model rather than an interactional model that I think a lot of librarians seek to emulate. So this might increase perception of libraries more as customer service organizations. I think customer service may be an element of our work, but I think of us much more as community engagement workers than customer service workers. So could this, if we're having or encouraging these really transactional interactions with AI where a user demands something, the AI returns it, are we stepping away from this role of, interactional community advocates, community engagement specialists, and sort of pigeonholing ourselves into more of a service role, maybe more like a commercial service role specifically. So all of this said, what should we do? I have my recommendations really fall into two key categories here. So the first is that we should rethink AI phenotype and genotype. The way it is largely problematic, and there's so much potential to turn it around and make it really positive. And the second thing is that we should continue in this ongoing, never-ending process of learning, teaching what we've learned, and getting involved in several ways that I'll mention. So in terms of rethinking phenotype and genotype, one of the first things that we can do is advance gender neutral voices and move away from this male female options binary. So I'm gonna play a video, and I hope the sound works. Of this is a genderless voice named Q. It's available at genderlessvoice.com. And Q will explain the motivation for the people who made this. But you'll see as I play the video, it's this interactive website. So if you move your cursor up, you'll see it's more of a feminized voice. And if you move your cursor down, it becomes more of a masculinized voice. So you'll see how it changes. Let me go ahead and play it now.
Hi, I'm Q, the world's first genderless voice assistant. Think of me like Siri or Alexa, but neither male nor female. I'm created for a future where we are no longer defined by gender, but rather how we define ourselves. My voice was recorded by people who neither identify as male nor female, and then altered to sound gender neutral, putting my voice between 145 and 175 hertz, a range defined by audio researchers. But for me to become a third option for voice assistants, I need your help. Share my voice with Apple, Amazon, Google, and Microsoft. And together we can ensure that technology recognizes us all. Thanks for listening. Q.
Okay, so I think Q presents an interesting option. There is, beyond advancing gender neutral voices, there's also the idea that we can just advance gender neutral personas more broadly. So a couple examples here. Kasisto has Kai, which is just this this cloud with no apparent gender. Similarly, Capital One has Eno, which appears to be equally genderless or without gender. And then there are a lot more examples besides this, but finally I chose to include Alibaba's voice assistant, Ali Genie, which is similar to Alexa in that it's like a smart home speaker, but it lets you put this little face of a cat on it. So that said, we can move away from personifying or humanizing AI at all. That's another option. And some organizations are certainly making efforts to do that. For example, there's There's the chatbot Busy that I mentioned earlier from the University of Oklahoma. And crucially, I think here, I think this is an ethical thing, and it's this whole other topic, but there's this idea that AI should announce that it is AI. So you'll see that this is one of the first things that Busy does, lets users know, like, I am a chatbot, so probably my capabilities are going to be limited. Just so you know, I'm not a fellow human being. And I do 24/7 chat for, well, I don't do it 24/7, but I do chat services for my library and other libraries that my library is in a co-op with. And every once in a while, the first thing that somebody asks me is, are you a robot? So I think it's totally fair to try to just answer this question right off the bat. And I think it's really fair for people to be asking that too. So specifically to libraries, there are a lot of things that we can do in adopting AI, because I do think that adopting AI and digital assistants is a good thing. I just think we want to be careful that we're doing it in ways that are helpful rather than harmful. And that really starts with just being choosy, not necessarily accepting whatever product is on the market, whatever is easily available, but really, being selective in our decisions about what to implement and how to implement it. I think that it's really, really crucial. I talked about tech sector demographics not having gender parity at the moment. I hope that changes. And since this is an issue that is getting so much attention, I'm confident that, or at least really hopeful that it will. I think outside of the high-tech industry, I also think it's really important that libraries work to achieve more equal gender representation on their technical teams, who are the teams that are most likely to be implementing this high-tech kind of stuff. Libraries are in such a cool position to work with this issue, I think, because a lot of what we do is educational and informative. So we can, when we're interacting with search engines, databases, digital assistants alongside our library users, we can bring up these issues, and we can bring up these issues in informal conversations and in more formal structured ones too. Libraries can do things and do things like run book clubs, for example, provide workshops, provide classes. And I think that conversation on tech ethics in general and AI ethics in particular should really be a part of that. I also think that learning about these topics really should be supported by LAS programs and by professional associations. So there is just so much out there to learn, and this is really just the tip of the iceberg. So if we have, professional, paraprofessional, co-curricular learning communities that are dedicated to this, and we put our ideas together, I think amazing things can come from that really, really quickly. And a final bullet that I have here is the idea that librarians are amazing at research. Like we're professional researchers in so many ways, right? So we should be participating in research and scholarship, especially because we work so closely with users and really have a sense of, both the professional librarian perspective and the user perspective. We have so many research tools at our fingertips, and I think so many librarians just can present so much rich knowledge on tech ethics, again, because this is an equity issue for our library users. So I think anyone who is interested should be definitely participating in research and scholarship and just learning about this in general. So I have just two key questions to really summarize, or I guess at least try to point at least my thinking or our thinking in the direction for the future. So I want to paraphrase these two questions that I've come across in my research. And the first we've already heard, it's adapted from Caroline Criado Perez's Invisible Women. So if you'll remember, she was explaining that tech is often approached from a problem-solving perspective. So I think we, in using AI or implementing it or encouraging others to use it, we can ask ourselves just simply, with this technology, what problem are we trying to solve? So if we create a digital assistant and we want to feminize it, what problem does that solve? What problem does it solve to assign a gender to it? Or perhaps does that gender assignment, create a problem that we're going to have to undo later on. So this leads me to the next question. The second question on the screen here comes from Zoe Quinn, who is a game developer, and they tweeted in response to Microsoft's chatbot Tay that I talked a bit about earlier. And the implication of this tweet was, or the summary of it is, if you're not thinking about how this technology could potentially cause some sort of harm, you're not really doing the full job as a technologist. That's an essential part of the job, really should be these days, right? So my, not quite paraphrase, I think I made the question a little bit longer, but my question is, or it starts with the acknowledgement that this technology may have a range of benefits, but it also may have some negative implications that we haven't thought of yet. So how could this tech be used to cause harm? How could it negatively affect some people, and how instead can we make sure that it doesn't? How can we switch that and into something good, and to put a little bit of good into the world? So at this point, I want to thank you for your time and attention. It's so much fun for me to get to talk about these topics. And if you are interested or want to continue the conversation, definitely feel free to reach out to me. My email is lmbrown@hpu.edu. And you can also find me on my website. And I just want to make sure that this is included. So I honor all the amazing work that's made this presentation possible. And there's so much also beyond this, but these are the references that I've used here today. So I see some awesome comments in the chat box. Yeah, oh, I wanted to go back and acknowledge Libby from Overdrive. Yes, I use Libby almost every day. And you are completely right. I didn't, even having done this presentation, didn't make the connection that Libby is a feminine name, right? And Gabby from Apollo Biblionics. Yeah, and I have some recommendations for favorite resources on AI. I am going to copy these. This means a lot to me. Thank you. So are there any questions or any comments that anyone wants to get into at this point?
I just wanted to thank you for your research. This is a subject that's like brand new to me as of the beginning of this year, and I just started getting interested in it as well. Actually, because of a presentation from somebody at ALA Midwinter from Hawaii. They were doing a presentation about all the things they're doing with AI in the state. And I just think it's so cool that Hawaii is sort of this central hub of AI research, and just wanted to thank you for the presentation and the research. And this is really cool. Thanks.
Thank you so much for saying that. And that is really incredible to hear. I actually wasn't aware of that Midwinter presentation, but that is the plan for later today. I will go and find it. So thanks for the recommendation, pointing me in that direction.
Sure. Thanks so much.
I have a question in the chat. What was the book title author you mentioned? Oh, yes, good question. I love this book. It's called Invisible Women, Data Bias in a World Designed for Men. And it's written by Caroline Criado Perez. So she's great. It's this great mix of this, I think, like pretty heavy academic and popular writing. Somehow she pulls it off. But yeah, really recommend it. All right. So if there are no other questions, again, I just want to thank you so much for your time. It's been a real honor to get to talk about all of this. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day and the rest of your semester. And again, feel free to reach out. We can keep this conversation going. So thank you.